The night my world nearly collapsed began with a single piercing alarm. My mother's oxygen concentrator shrieked like a dying siren, its screen flashing low power. I lunged toward the generator I had installed for this exact emergency, only to find it plastered with a neon HOA violation sticker, wires cut clean by someone who thought rules mattered more than life. Through the thin walls of our house, I could almost hear Karen's smug voice echoing, "If you can't follow the bylaws, maybe your mother doesn't belong here." My fists clenched. The battery backup counted down in red digits, seconds bleeding away. I wasn't just fighting for my mother's breath, I was fighting against an HOA president drunk on power. What she didn't know was that her cruelty had already set something in motion, because within minutes the night sky would roar with thunder and Black Hawk helicopters would descend on our pristine neighborhood like angels of retribution. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment with your location and the time you're watching. I want to see where my neighbors are tuning in from around the world. When I first moved my mother Ruth into my home by the lake, I thought I was giving her peace. She'd spent years fighting pulmonary fibrosis, her lungs stiff as paper, her body reliant on machines to do what her chest could no longer manage. The house was supposed to be sanctuary, quiet water, swaying pines, sunsets that painted the sky gold. Instead, it became a gilded cage with Karen Whitmore as the self-appointed warden. Karen wasn't just the HOA president. She was the HOA power suits at block parties, clipboards at sunrise, and an unholy alliance with Brett Nolan, her enforcer. Brett strutted around in his HOA polo like it was a badge of honor, snapping photos of fences and trash cans as if he were CSI Suburbia. To them, my mother's oxygen concentrator wasn't a medical necessity, it was unsightly. My backup generator, a noise hazard. The very equipment that kept her alive was recast as violations against their precious bylaws. I still remember the first letter. Crisp white paper, black serif font, stuffed into an envelope that looked official enough to be tax season doom. Notice of violation, unauthorized exterior equipment. They cited me for installing the generator near the garage, claiming it disrupted the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood. I wanted to laugh. This was life support, not a lawn gnome. But as the weeks passed, the letters multiplied, fines, stacking like bricks, each one a reminder that in their world appearances outweighed breath. Mom tried to make light of it. She had that soft humor that made nurses adore her. "Maybe they're jealous," she whispered one night, tugging at the oxygen tube coiled like ivy across her lap. "Not everyone can pull off the sci-fi look." She smiled, but her eyes were tired. Each fine, each threat was another weight on my shoulders. That's when Maya Tran entered the picture. Maya lived 3 doors down, an ER nurse, with the calm, no-nonsense air of someone who'd seen more blood and chaos than most soldiers. She'd stop by after night shifts, still in scrubs, to check on Mom. When I showed her the violation letters, she shook her head and muttered, "Unbelievable. You need a safety plan and documentation." So I started a binder, every notice, every email, every doctor's letter. My home office turned into a war room. Stacks of statutes highlighted ADA provisions, fair housing regulations. I filed formal accommodation requests, citing my mother's condition, providing medical notes signed by specialists. Each time, Karen and her board replied with the same icy indifference, denied for non-compliance with community standards. At first, I tried diplomacy. I attended a board meeting, sat in a folding chair under flickering fluorescent lights, listening as Karen outlined plans for new fencing around the community pool. When it was my turn, I rose and spoke calmly about my mother, about the need for compassion in the rules. I quoted the ADA word for word. Karen, hair lacquered into an impenetrable helmet, leaned forward and said, with that syrupy voice she used when the cameras were on, "Daniel, we sympathize. But rules are rules. If we make exceptions for you, we open the floodgates," the room murmured. A neighbor in the back coughed, shifting uncomfortably. Brett smirked, scribbling something on his clipboard. I wanted to slam my fist down, shout that this wasn't about lawn ornaments or floodgates. It was about whether my mother lived to see another sunrise. Instead, I swallowed my rage and kept my voice level. But inside, I felt the crackling pressure of something that would eventually explode. By midsummer, the citations escalated into what Karen called courtesy notices. They threatened to shut off services if I didn't remove non-compliant structures, which meant the generator. One notice even referenced unauthorized medical equipment visible from common areas. Unauthorized. As if breathing were some kind of privilege she could revoke. Mom's health declined under the constant stress. Her oxygen levels dipped whenever the power flickered, which it did often in that aging grid. I reinforced the house with battery backups labeled oxygen tanks, even laminated physician notes to post on the door for EMS. Still, Karen and her board dismissed each measure as insufficient. One evening, as the sun sank red over the lake, I stood in the yard watching Brett snap photos of our windows. "Documentation," he said smugly when I confronted him. "We have to prove non-compliance." His camera flash reflected off the oxygen tube draped across the arm of Mom's chair inside. I wanted to rip the camera from his hands. Instead, I raised my phone and filmed him right back. "Two can play this game," I muttered. The tension in the neighborhood grew thick enough to choke on. Neighbors whispered over hedges, some sympathetic, others terrified of crossing Karen. The HOA's group chat buzzed with petty debates. Was my generator truly disruptive? Did medical equipment count as clutter? It was absurd theater, and Karen relished her starring role. Then came the wildfire drill. The county scheduled it as part of the annual emergency preparedness exercise, a chance to test evacuation routes and fire breaks. I volunteered to brief neighbors about CERT procedures, how to handle power outages, how to keep medical devices running in emergencies. I knew this stuff cold. After all, I'd been a CERT instructor for years, long before Mom's illness forced me to apply it at home, but Karen, of course, accused me of fear-mongering. She sent a mass email declaring the drill unnecessary panic and warning residents that unauthorized meetings on emergency planning were subject to fines. That was when I realized Karen wasn't just ignorant. She was dangerous. She wielded rules like weapons, and in her hands they could kill. I looked at my mother, frail tubing coiling across her lap, each breath a fragile negotiation with her failing lungs. I promised her that no HOA tyrant, no matter how smug, would take away the air she needed. I didn't know yet how far Karen would go, but I knew this. The fight wasn't just coming, it had already begun. The funny thing about living under Karen's HOA reign was that it didn't feel like a war, it felt like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Every morning I'd step onto my porch, coffee in hand, only to find another envelope tucked neatly under the mat. Violation notice. Courtesy citation. Community reminder. Each one stacked into the binder. I kept on my desk, that binder now bulging like a courtroom exhibit. But paper was only the start. Brett Nolan, Karen's self-anointed deputy, had turned surveillance into his personal sport. One morning at 6 a.m., I caught him crouching near my driveway camera lens, glinting as he photographed my garage outlet. Evidence, he grunted when I opened the door. He looked like a mall cop who never made the academy belly, straining against that HOA polo clipboard dangling like it carried the 10 Commandments. Inside, my mother tried to keep her composure. But the stress was chewing at her lungs, faster than the fibrosis ever could. Every violation notice set her pulse racing. She'd say, "Don't let them win, Danny," but her voice grew thinner each week. I responded the only way I knew how, by fortifying. If Karen was going to treat me like a criminal, I'd behave like a strategist. I installed a larger battery backup for the concentrator, labeled every tank and cord, even built laminated signs to slap on the door in case paramedics showed up, oxygen-dependent patient inside. Life support equipment, do not disconnect. Of course, Karen didn't appreciate my initiative. At the next HOA meeting, she waved one of my laminated signs in the air like it was contraband. "Visual clutter," she announced. Against community standards. I was sitting right there, hands folded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Because what else could I do? Argue that keeping someone alive wasn't clutter? I stood up calm as I could manage and said, "This sign isn't optional. It's medical protocol, approved by emergency services." Karen tilted her head, smiling that predator's smile. "Daniel, if we bend the rules for you, where does it stop? Someone else will want neon posters for allergies or banners for their dietary needs. We have to be consistent." The absurdity almost broke me. Allergies, dietary needs. My mother's lungs were collapsing and Karen wanted consistency. I glanced around the room. Some neighbors wouldn't meet my eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably. There were murmurs, but Karen kept her grip on the gavel, pounding the table for silence. Brett leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smug as if he'd already won. Still, cracks were forming. I noticed one woman in the back, Mrs. Patel, whose husband relied on dialysis, leaning forward, frowning at Karen's words. A young father whispered to his wife, shaking his head. They might not have spoken up, but seeds had been planted. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't done. They escalated from letters to courtesy visits. Brett showed up with a clipboard and a measuring tape, crouching by the generator to photograph the clearance. Another day, I caught him scribbling notes about the extension cord running from the garage. When I challenged him, he claimed it was an unauthorized modification of the exterior facade. "Exterior facade," I repeated, incredulous. "It's a power cord. Community integrity," Brett barked. "That's what this neighborhood is about. Integrity." That word burned like acid. I started documenting everything, not just their letters, but their behavior. I set up cameras facing the yard-kept voice recorders, handy-logged every interaction with timestamps. When Brett lurked near the window one morning, I filmed him, his reflection caught perfectly in the glass as he snapped photos of my mother's tubing. "Smile for the camera," I said through the door. He scowled and stalked away, but I knew the footage was gold. Then came the wildfire drill. The county had scheduled it for months. Sirens, evacuation routes, even National Guard choppers doing practice runs over the ridge. As a CERT instructor, I volunteered to run a briefing for neighbors. I handed out flyers, showed people how to check backup power, explained how EMS needed unobstructed access through our gated community. It should have been common sense. But Karen stormed into my session midway, high heels, clicking like gunfire on the pavement. She raised her voice over mine. "This is unauthorized fear-mongering. Daniel Hale does not represent the HOA." I turned microphone in hand and calmly said, "I don't represent the HOA. I represent the county's community emergency response team. If you have a problem, call the fire marshal." Her face flushed crimson. The crowd of neighbors glanced between us, some whispering, some smirking. Karen was rattled, and I knew it. But she doubled down. That night, an email hit every resident's inbox. "Unauthorized emergency meetings will not be tolerated. Do not be misled by individuals exaggerating risks." I nearly laughed myself sick. Exaggerating risks. This from the woman who threatened to fine someone for leaving a pink flamingo in their yard overnight. But beneath the humor, there was danger. Karen's latest courtesy notice arrived the next morning. This one, chilling in its precision. Failure to remove unauthorized power equipment may result in disconnection of services pending compliance. It was no longer an empty threat. They weren't just talking fines. They were threatening power. I stared at the notice, heart pounding. My mind ran the numbers: how long Mom's concentrator would last on battery, how quickly her portable tanks would run dry, how far the nearest hospital was if an ambulance even made it past the gate. That was the moment it hit me. Karen wasn't bluffing. She was escalating. She'd built her empire on petty power plays, and now she was ready to weaponize electricity itself. And if she dared to flip that switch, she wouldn't just be violating bylaws. She'd be gambling with my mother's life. The pressure was unbearable. I felt it every time the lights flickered, every time Brett's camera flashed, every time my mother's breath rasped in the quiet of the house. We were living in a neighborhood where compassion was outlawed and cruelty was codified in print. I began to wonder, how far would Karen go to prove she was queen of this little kingdom? And what would it take to finally break her throne? I didn't have to wonder for long. Because Karen was about to cross a line she could never uncross. It happened on a Sunday evening, just as the cicadas started their nightly chorus, and the lake reflected streaks of molten orange. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when the lights flickered once, twice, then snapped off. For a moment I thought it was just another rolling blackout, the kind our grid seemed to cough up whenever the summer heat pressed too hard. But then I heard the shrill alarm from the living room, Mom's concentrator. I dropped the knife and sprinted down the hall. The machine's screen blinked red, power disconnected. The backup battery whined, kicking in its countdown clock, flashing like a bomb timer in a bad action film. I glanced at the wall outlet, dead. Every other socket in the room was lifeless too. Panic and fury hit me at the same time. I rushed to the garage. The generator sat in the corner, silent, a fresh violation. "Remove immediately" sticker plastered across it. But that wasn't what stopped me cold. The power sub-panel on the wall had been tampered with, the main breaker for our unit flipped down, and a note taped over it in neat block letters: "Pending compliance. HOA, Brett." I could see his thick handwriting, smug and blocky. I slammed the breaker up, but nothing happened. My jaw clenched as I realized he had locked the panel shut with a padlock. I stormed outside, fists shaking, phone already recording. Across the lawn there he was, Brett, polo shirt untucked, clipboard in hand. And beside him, Karen, arms folded like a queen, surveying her conquered kingdom. "You cut my power," I shouted, camera pointed straight at them. Karen's smile was sugar and venom. "Daniel, please. We simply enforced compliance. Unauthorized modifications to the electrical system can't be tolerated. Liability, you understand." "My mother is on oxygen," I roared. "You knew this. You signed the accommodation request denial yourself," Brett shrugged. "Rules are rules." My voice shook with rage. "This is criminal obstruction. You've endangered her life." Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "If you'd simply removed the non-compliant equipment when asked, this wouldn't have happened." I wanted to leap across the grass and tear that smirk from her face. Instead, I held the phone steady. Every second of this was evidence. Behind me, the concentrator alarm screamed louder. Mom's fragile breaths were thinning uneven. My stomach twisted. I didn't have time for theatrics. I spun and dialed 911. My voice cracked as I explained the situation: power cut, oxygen-dependent patient backup failing. The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately from routine to urgent. "Stay on the line, sir. Paramedics are en route. Can you move your mother outside?" I glanced toward the gated entrance, remembered the stories of ambulances delayed at the keypad guards, demanding proof of residency. My blood ran cold. Number. They won't get in. The HOA controls the gate. The dispatcher hesitated. Then copy. Contacting County Emergency Operations Center. My training kicked in. Years as a CERT instructor teaching people to prepare for disasters were suddenly the only thing holding me together. I barked into the phone: escalate. Request medevac. National Guards running wildfire drills nearby. Patch me through. The dispatcher complied. Within minutes I was speaking to the county EOC. I laid it out fast. Critical oxygen-dependent patient. Power deliberately cut. Gate restricted. EMS access obstructed. Immediate airlift required. Silence then. A clipped voice. Copy that, Hale. We've got guard birds already airborne for the drill. Diverting now. I turned back to Karen. She was still standing there, smug in her certainty that the HOA had triumphed. "This is documented," I told her, voice steady now, iron in my tone. "You didn't just break rules. You broke the law. You cut off life support." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Brett shifted uneasily, as if realizing for the first time that this wasn't just another petty victory. Minutes stretched like hours. I hustled back inside, hoisting Mom gently into her wheelchair, dragging the portable tank along. The battery backup blinked its final bars. Sweat poured down my temples as I wheeled her onto the porch. Then I heard it, a low thrum building in the distance. The unmistakable chop of rotor blades. The sound swelled, rolling over the neighborhood like thunder. Windows rattled, dogs barked, people spilled from their houses, phones raised to the sky. The first Black Hawk descended over the HOA's pristine clubhouse, its floodlights slicing the night. Another hovered above the cul-de-sac rotor wash, blasting Karen's perfect flower beds flat. Soldiers in fatigues leapt out, establishing a perimeter with the precision of a well-oiled machine. I felt tears prick my eyes, not from fear, but from sheer gut-punching relief. Help had come, and it had come in force. Karen staggered backward, hair whipping in the rotor wash, screaming, "This is private property, you can't land here." A medic jogged up to me, kneeling at my mother's side with calm efficiency. "Sergeant Alvarez, National Guard," he barked over the roar. "We've got her, sir. You did the right thing calling it in." Behind him, Fire Marshal Ortiz stepped off the chopper, radio crackling. His eyes swept the clubhouse, then landed on Karen. His voice was like a hammer. "Who authorized cutting power to a medical patient?" Karen sputtered, pointing at Brett. Brett stammered, pointing back at her. And all around us, neighbors watched with wide eyes, cameras recording HOA group chats blowing up with photos of Black Hawks parked on manicured grass. The HOA's illusion of control was cracking apart, shredded by the roar of rotor blades. I glanced at Karen one last time. She looked small now, her clipboard kingdom collapsing under the weight of real authority. What she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The moment those Black Hawks touched down, our neighborhood's illusion of order shattered like glass under a hammer. For years, Karen's word had been law, bylaws, fines, courtesy notices delivered with a venom-laced smile. But the second rotor wash flattened her prized begonias, her reign ended. The medics worked fast. Sergeant Alvarez and his crew moved my mother with surgical precision, their voices clipped but calm over the chaos. They transferred her to a stretcher fitted with portable oxygen, checking vitals, and sliding her into the belly of the chopper, where equipment hummed with reliability Karen could never comprehend. I hovered close, fighting the urge to collapse with relief. For the first time in months, my mother was safer in the hands of combat medics than in her own home under the HOA. Floodlights swept across the manicured lawn. Fire Marshal Ortiz barked orders into his radio, designating the HOA's precious clubhouse as an incident command post. Deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape. Soldiers secured the perimeter, their boots chewing up Karen's perfectly edged grass. The sound was beautiful, a new order imposed over Karen's tyranny. Karen herself was a sight to behold. Her arms flailed as she screeched, "You can't be here. This is private property. I'm the HOA president. I demand you leave immediately." Ortiz turned, his reflective vest glowing in the floodlights. He looked at her the way a surgeon looks at a tumor, clinical, detached. "Ma'am, under state emergency statutes, Your authority is suspended. You obstructed EMS access and tampered with critical infrastructure. Step aside." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She pointed at me, voice cracking. "He exaggerates. He's been manipulating everyone." But Ortiz had already spotted the note taped over my breaker box, Brett's signature scrawl, glaring in black ink. He ripped it down, held it up under the floodlight, and said, "Who wrote this?" Brett tried to melt into the background, but the deputies flanked him. One tapped his body cam. "We've got footage of you at the subpanel, sir." "You want to explain?" Brett stammered. "Karen told me it was just a temporary disconnection," Karen shrieked. "Don't you dare put this on me, Brett. I filmed everything from my porch." The lens caught Karen's fury. Brett sweat, the soldiers calmly moving through the chaos. Evidence. Receipts. Proof that this wasn't paranoia, it was criminal negligence. Neighbors spilled out of their homes in clusters, pajamas flapping in the rotor wash, phones raised high. The HOA group chat pinged nonstop. Is this real? Why are there helicopters? Did Karen really cut his power? Screenshots and shaky videos flew across social media faster than the choppers could spin. I caught sight of Maya, my ER nurse neighbor, pushing through the crowd. Her hair was windblown, her eyes fierce. She clapped a hand on my shoulder and shouted over the roar, "She's stable. They've got her oxygen regulated." "You did the right thing." For the first time in hours, my lungs remembered how to expand. Relief warred with a new fury bubbling inside me. Because as grateful as I was for the medics, I couldn't ignore the truth. This didn't need to happen. My mother didn't need helicopters and floodlights. All she needed was compassion, and Karen had strangled that out of the neighborhood long ago. The deputies pressed Karen and Brett against the clubhouse wall, not in cuffs yet, but under the bright gaze of every phone camera in the cul-de-sac. Ortiz asked pointed questions: who authorized the lock on the subpanel, who ordered the power cut, who ignored ADA accommodation requests. Each question was a nail in the coffin of their authority. Karen tried to spin it. We were protecting the community from liability. His equipment was unsightly, dangerous, even dangerous, I barked, unable to hold back. The only danger here is you. You cut power to a life support machine. You left my mother to suffocate because you didn't like how a generator looked next to your rose bushes. The crowd murmured, neighbors exchanging glances. Some nodded, others whispered, but the tide had turned. Karen's veneer of control had cracked, and behind it people saw her cruelty naked and raw. The soldiers ignored her entirely. To them, she was background noise, less significant than a gust of dust. They had a patient to save, and that patient was already being loaded for transport. Then Ortiz made the call that sealed her fate. "We're impounding the HOA clubhouse until further notice." Evidence collection. Karen's scream could have cracked glass. "You can't. That's our property, the dues, the insurance." But no one listened. Deputies rolled crime scene tape across the front doors. Soldiers stacked gear inside. The clubhouse, once Karen's throne room, was now a command post under state control. I turned my camera back on myself, voice, steady eyes, hard. "Let the record show. I said that tonight when an HOA president thought she was above the law came down from the sky." Karen lunged at me, but a deputy stepped between us. She was seething hair, wild mascara streaking down her face. For the first time, she wasn't queen of the neighborhood. She was just another defendant waiting for charges. As the second chopper lifted off, carrying my mother safely toward the hospital, the crowd broke into scattered applause. Not for me, not even for the medics, but for the simple, undeniable fact that Karen had finally lost. The night air smelled of jet fuel and crushed flowers. The floodlights faded as soldiers packed up equipment, their job done. But mine was just beginning. Because I knew Karen would fight back with lawyers and lies, clawing at every technicality she could. That was fine. I was ready. I had footage, documents, witnesses, and a neighborhood that had just seen with their own eyes who Karen truly was. She thought cutting off my mother's oxygen would bend me into compliance. Instead, it summoned Black Hawks to her doorstep and spotlighted her corruption for the world to see. And this was only the prelude. When the soldiers finally lifted off, the neighborhood was left in eerie silence, broken only by the buzzing of 100 text notifications. Karen's kingdom lay in ruins, the clubhouse wrapped in yellow tape, Brett sweating bullets under deputy questions, and neighbors whispering like kids who had just witnessed the principal being marched out in handcuffs. I should have felt triumphant. My mother was safe at the hospital, stabilized under the care of professionals who didn't treat her life like an aesthetic inconvenience. But triumph wasn't what I felt. What I felt was focus. Because now, with the HOA stripped bare under the rotor wash, I had the leverage to finish what Karen had started. First step, gather receipts. I spent the next 2 days in my office binder, open laptop, glowing cameras, humming. Every violation notice Karen had ever sent scanned. Every email denying reasonable accommodation uploaded. every time-stamped video of Brett lurking with his camera cataloged. I built a timeline so clean and precise it could have been taught in law school, from the first unsightly equipment letter to the night Karen personally signed the order isolating my power. Maya stopped by with coffee, dropping her ER badge on the desk as she leaned over my shoulder. "You're building a case file, aren't you?" "Not just a case," I said, flipping to a tab marked statutes. "A hammer," she smirked. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." The hammer grew heavier with each document. I filed formal complaints with the County ADA office, the Fair Housing Department, and the State Attorney General. Maya added her clinical notes confirming Mom's oxygen dependency and the risk of even brief interruptions. It wasn't just my word against Karen's anymore. It was medical fact, documented and undeniable. But paper trails alone don't topple tyrants. For that you need people. So I turned to the neighbors. At first they were hesitant, burned too many times by Karen's intimidation tactics. But the helicopter spectacle had shifted something. People who'd stayed silent now found their voices. Mrs. Patel told me how Karen once threatened fines when her husband's dialysis supplies were delivered outside approved hours. A young couple admitted Karen had blocked their ramp request because it interfered with the visual flow of the street. One after another stories poured in. I listened, documented, and then with a calm smile slid proxy forms across the table. "If you're tired of living under a tyrant sign here, there's a special election clause in the bylaws. We only need 51% to trigger a recall." The irony was delicious. The same bylaws Karen worshipped would become the guillotine blade. Maya helped me host quiet gatherings in living rooms and backyards away from Brett's camera lens. We shared stories, compared violation letters, laughed at the absurdity of someone measuring grass height with a ruler. The laughter turned into resolve. Within a week, my stack of proxies was thick enough to choke a shredder. Meanwhile, Karen tried to salvage her image. She sent out glossy mailers, yes, actual mailers, claiming the helicopter incident was a gross misunderstanding orchestrated by a disgruntled resident. She accused me of exploiting emergency services for personal drama. But the internet never forgets. Videos of her screaming private property at soldiers had gone viral. Comment sections roasted her harder than any courtroom could. Memes popped up overnight, Karen with helicopter rotors photoshopped into her hair, Brett in a mall cop uniform holding caution tape. The HOA board's credibility was shredded by pixels before any judge touched the case. Still, I wasn't reckless. Karen had money connections and the kind of entitlement that made her believe she could outspend justice. So I doubled down. I filed discovery requests through my attorney, forcing the board to hand over emails and internal memos. And oh, the gems we found. One thread in particular sealed their fate, Brett writing, "If we cut his power, he'll cave. No way he can risk Mommy running out of air." Karen's reply, "Do it." He needs to learn the HOA runs this neighborhood, not his sob stories. I almost pitied them. Almost. Because when I presented that email chain at the recall planning meeting, the room gasped as if they'd witnessed a car crash. "This isn't just negligence," I said, my voice steady. "It's malice." Maya leaned forward, speaking for the first time. "And it's criminal. I'll testify." The momentum was unstoppable now. Neighbors once paralyzed by fear were suddenly energized, scribbling names on recall petitions, whispering strategies. Even those who defended Karen before looked pale, realizing they'd hitched their wagon to a sinking ship. Karen tried to fight back the only way she knew how: theatrics. She staged a community unity barbecue, plastering posters about healing divisions and focusing on the future. But the turnout was pathetic. Half a dozen loyalists sipping flat soda while the rest of the neighborhood gathered in my backyard, signing proxies and swapping stories of her abuses. I stood before them with the binder pages fanned like wings. "We're not just taking her down," I told them. "We're rewriting what this neighborhood stands for. Compassion, safety, dignity, not fear." For the first time since moving Mom in, I felt something stronger than rage. I felt solidarity. These people weren't just my neighbors anymore, they were allies. And together, we were about to make Karen face a reckoning she couldn't bully, fine, or threaten her way out of. The recall election date was set, the proxies stacked high, the legal hammer was cocked. Karen thought she could cut my mother's oxygen and leave us powerless. Instead, she'd handed me the one thing she feared most: a united community armed with the truth. And soon every spotlight, every camera, every vote would be pointed straight at her. The night of the special recall meeting felt like the Super Bowl of suburban politics. The HOA clubhouse, once Karen's throne room, was packed so tight, people had to stand along the back wall. Folding chairs scraped against tile floors, the smell of burnt coffee lingered from the lobby urn, and a low buzz of anticipation rippled through the air. For years, neighbors had whispered about Karen in driveways and cul-de-sacs, but tonight the whispers became a roar. I arrived with my binder tucked under one arm, a portable projector in the other. Maya walked beside me, carrying a stack of witness statements like ammunition. Even Fire Marshal Ortiz was there in uniform. Seated near the front arms, crossed a living reminder that Karen's authority had already been trumped by real law. Karen, of course, had dressed for battle blazer sharp enough to cut glass pearls glinting under fluorescent lights, hair lacquered into immovable perfection. Brett lurked at her side, eyes darting like a cornered animal. She opened the meeting with her usual pomp, gavel cracking against the table. "This session is called to order," she declared, voice trembling only slightly. "We're here to address baseless accusations and restore confidence in our leadership." The murmurs from the crowd said otherwise. When my turn came, I rose slowly, clicking on the projector. The screen lit up with the first exhibit, a timeline stretching across weeks, each violation notice lined up like dominoes. Gasps followed as I flipped through evidence, emails, photos, videos. "This," I said, voice steady, "isn't about aesthetics. It isn't about rules. It's about cruelty codified into policy." The footage rolled, Brett cutting across my yard, snapping photos of oxygen tubing. Karen in a board meeting, waving my laminated emergency signs like contraband. A freeze frame of the breaker box padlocked shut with pending compliance. HOA scrawled across it. The room shifted uneasily. I felt the weight of eyes, some widening in shock, others narrowing in anger, not at me but at the leaders who had humiliated them all for years. Then I played the clip that broke the dam. Karen's voice sharp and unmistakable, ordering Brett, "Make it hurt, so he complies." Gasps. A woman in the back covered her mouth. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Karen shot to her feet, screeching. "That's taken out of context." I raised a hand, silencing her. Context. I clicked to the next slide, the email thread. Brett's typed words, "If we cut his power, he'll cave. No way he can risk mommy running out of air." And Karen's reply, "Do it." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room burned into her, into Brett, into the empire they'd built on intimidation. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, scanning the room, "this isn't about me. It's about whether you want to live in fear of citations, fines, and retaliation, or whether you want a neighborhood built on compassion and common sense. Tonight you decide." Maya stepped forward, then her voice calm, clinical. She read from her notes describing how oxygen deprivation can kill in minutes, how cutting power to medical equipment wasn't just negligent, it was lethal. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Her authority was ironclad, and the room listened in stunned silence. Karen tried one last gambit. She slammed her hand on the table. "This is a witch hunt. He's manipulating you with sob stories. I've sacrificed for this community. Without me, the property values. Without you, Mrs." Patel interrupted from the audience, rising to her feet. "My husband would have had his dialysis interrupted. Without you, my neighbors wouldn't live in fear of fines for Christmas lights or wheelchair ramps." Others joined in voices, growing louder, angrier. A father shouted about the time Brett threatened to fine his kids for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A teenager called out that Karen made her mother cry over unauthorized garden gnomes. Every story piled atop the last, a mountain of grievances finally unchained. The gavel in Karen's hand was useless against the tide. The recall vote was called. Ballots shuffled, proxies counted, hands raised high. The results weren't close. A landslide. Karen and Brett were officially removed from the board, their reign collapsing under the very rules they'd once weaponized. The applause was thunderous, shaking the walls of the clubhouse. People hugged, laughed, even cried. Years of frustration released in one cathartic eruption. Deputies stepped forward, serving Karen with notices of investigation, obstruction of emergency services, reckless endangerment violations of fair housing law. Brett's face went pale as a sheet. Karen sputtered, still shrieking about property values, even as neighbors filmed her meltdown. Then came the most powerful moment of the night. My mother, frail but determined, wheeled herself forward. The room quieted instantly. She placed trembling hands on the microphone and said, softly but firmly, "Policy without compassion is cruelty. Tonight you chose compassion. Thank you." Her words landed like an arrow in every heart. Even the deputies paused, faces softening. Some neighbors wiped tears from their eyes. I looked at Karen then. For the first time, she seemed small, her pearls, her blazer, her lacquered hair meaningless in the face of a community that had finally seen her for what she was. The gavel passed to an interim board chosen on the spot from among volunteers. Cheers erupted again, as new leaders promised transparency, fairness, and most importantly, basic humanity. I closed my binder, sliding it under my arm. The evidence had done its job. The neighbors had done theirs. Justice wasn't finished. There would be trials, hearings, restitution, but tonight Karen's stranglehold was broken. As people filed out into the night, I stood on the clubhouse steps breathing in the cool air. The sky was quiet now, no rotors, no floodlights, just stars glimmering faintly above. My mother sat beside me, a soft smile on her face. "You did it," she whispered. "No," I said, glancing back at the neighbors laughing and hugging. "We did." But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't completely over. Karen was cornered, yes, but cornered animals lash out. And I had one last card to play, one last truth to reveal. The real twist was still waiting in the wings. The morning after the recall, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer, as if someone had opened a window and let out years of stale, suffocating air. The crime scene tape was gone from the clubhouse, replaced by folding tables stacked with clipboards, sign-up sheets, and donuts. Instead of Karen's dictates, there were open discussions, laughter, neighbors actually listening to each other. The interim board wasted no time. They voted unanimously to add a compassion clause to the bylaws, guaranteeing reasonable accommodations for medical needs. EMS received permanent gate access codes, and neighbors formed a volunteer CERT team with Maya at the helm of first aid training. Watching her teach CPR on the same manicured lawn, where Karen once screamed at kids for running too loudly, was almost poetic. Restitution came next. All fines levied against residents for medical or accessibility needs were voided. Families were reimbursed, citations torn up in front of cheering crowds. One by one, people brought forward their stories, Christmas lights, ramps, chalk art, and each was acknowledged, apologized for, and wiped from the record. And yet amidst the healing, Karen lingered like a storm cloud at the edge of town. She wasn't gone. Not yet. She faced investigations, court dates, maybe even jail time, but entitlement doesn't die quietly. Rumors swirled that she was hiring lawyers, crafting counterclaims, planning some grand defense. That was fine, because I still had the twist she didn't know about. At the next community meeting, I stood before the crowd binder under my arm, projector glowing. "I want to clear something up," I began. The night the power was cut, I didn't summon Black Hawks out of nowhere. I didn't pull strings or stage a spectacle. Whispers ran through the room. I clicked to the next slide, photos of wildfire drill schedules, maps with evacuation routes, my own CERT credentials. I've been a county CERT instructor for years. I knew the guard was airborne for training. When Karen cut my mother's oxygen, I didn't make a miracle happen. I simply knew exactly whom to call. Karen didn't fall to luck or theatrics. She fell to her own arrogance. Gasps, then applause, rippled through the room. Neighbors looked at me differently, not just as the son who fought for his mother, but as someone who had prepared, planned, and stood his ground when it mattered most. Karen, if she ever watched the footage, would finally understand she hadn't been toppled by chance. She'd been dismantled by inevitability. Weeks later, the Black Hawk crew returned not for an emergency, but for a community demo. Kids climbed into the cockpit, parents snapped photos, Maya handed out first aid kits. My mother, frail but smiling, sat beneath a canopy, watching with misty eyes, as neighbors she barely knew came to shake her hand and thank her. Across the street, I spotted Karen, arms crossed, standing in the shadows of her porch. No pearls, no gavel, no power, just a woman watching the community she once ruled celebrate without her. And in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt closure. Because she could rage, she could plot, she could cling to her dwindling scraps of authority, but the neighborhood had chosen compassion over cruelty. And that was something she could never undo. The rotor blades thundered overhead once more, not as harbingers of fear, but as symbols of resilience. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, knowing my mother could too. Because in this neighborhood, finally, air was free. If this story taught me anything, it's that rules without compassion are nothing more than chains. My mother's oxygen wasn't a convenience, it was her lifeline. And yet one person's obsession with control nearly turned that lifeline into a noose. We live in a world where policy, power, and pride can collide in dangerous ways. But when people stand together armed with truth, unity, and yes, sometimes helicopters, tyranny doesn't stand a chance. What Karen forgot and what we must all remember is that authority is borrowed, not owned. Whether it's an HOA, a workplace, or a government office, leadership only matters if it protects the people it serves. Strip away empathy, and what's left is just cruelty with a badge. But here's the other truth: you don't need Black Hawks to make change. You need neighbors willing to speak, allies, willing to act, and the courage to push back when compassion is missing. Sometimes justice arrives with rotor blades. More often it arrives with signatures, votes, and voices refusing to be silenced. So here's my challenge to you watching this now. Think about your own community. Where are rules being used as weapons? Where could compassion change everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more stories like this, equal parts drama, satire, and hard-earned justice, hit that subscribe button, because this isn't just my fight, it's ours.